Hey listeners, welcome to episode 142 of the Ceres Podcast. In this episode I talk to Kate Nicholls, Chief Executive of UKHospitality. This is a heavy podcast with lots of information as we delve into the critical issues facing the hospitality sector. This episode centres around three key policy asks aimed at supporting hospitality businesses in the face of upcoming budget decisions. This isn't Kate's first time on the Ceres Podcast, and I absolutely love having Kate on because she explains all the issues that hospitality industry is facing perfectly. We address business rate increases, national insurance contributions, and lastly, we delve into the hot topic of VAT rates for hospitality, leisure and tourism. Kate shares her thoughts on the likelihood of government action. Throughout the episode, we continually return to the question of balancing the needs of independent businesses against those of larger chains and groups, and how government can equitably distribute support amongst the hospitality sector. Today's episode is brought to you by the Ceres Deep Fry Cleaner, the solution to extending the life of your oil and improving the taste of your fried food. Neglecting fry maintenance can lead to massive inefficiencies and issues down the line, but with Ceres Deep Fry Cleaner, you can easily implement a regular boil-out routine, ensuring your fries are clean, efficient and in tip-top condition. The Ceres Deep Fry Cleaner is a powerful, non-caustic solution specifically designed to eliminate stubborn carbon buildup, polymerization, and grease from the frying ranges, standalone fryers, and tabletop fryers. And why is this important, you may say? Cleaner fryers mean better oil life, lower gas consumption, better oil recovery, and tastier, crispier food. Plus, regular maintenance helps you spot problems well before they become problems. It's not just about cleaning, it's also about saving money and boosting your sales by having better tasting fried food. Imagine getting longer life from your capital equipment while serving better food. It's an absolute no-brainer. So order your deep fry cleaner today at ceres.shop, and remember, all purchases come with free delivery, so make the switch today for better frying practices, increase your oil life, save on costs, and serve food that keeps customers coming back. Now, let's get back to the show. Is there someone you think we should be talking to on the Ceres Podcast? Is there someone doing something really interesting in hospitality or agriculture? If that's a big yes, then let me know at stelios@worldofceres.com. We have some really great plans lined up for the Ceres Podcast, and we can't wait for them to start unfolding. This year is going to be a busy year with budgets and elections, so we hope to keep you in the loop. We will link to the three asks of UK Hospitality article that we have on our blog. We've got new articles this week already, and they include Hawksmoor sizzles with record turnover and profits, Jeremy Hunt is rethinking the tourist tax in the UK, and Wagamama is to fuel growth with 10 site openings in the UK. This is just in these few days already, and we've got a lot more planned. If you want to keep in the loop with what we're doing at Ceres, then you should be following us on social media. But remember, to get information delivered directly to your inbox, you need to join our mailing list. The only place you are going to see special offers from us is in your inbox. We will never post on social media about special offers. All links discussed in this intro will be in the episode show notes. So, on to today's episode with Kate from UK Hospitality. If you're not following her, follow her on LinkedIn, Twitter, follow UK Hospitality on all social media platforms. Let me know what you think of their three asks to government. And if you have a moment, do us a favour and leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. Hi Kate, welcome to the Ceres Podcast again.
Well, thank you for having me back. It's always a pleasure to be able to have a chat with you.
Well, we love having you on. You know your beans, so you can come on whenever you want. So tell us a little bit about what you do and UK Hospitality. Let's start there.
Okay, so UK Hospitality is the national trade body for hospitality operators and employers. And our definition of hospitality is broad. So it's everything to do with eating and drinking out, accommodation providers, but also into that entertainment and meeting space. So we represent everything from a single site independent coffee shop and takeaway right the way through to the national chains of pubs, bars, restaurants, hotels. We've got 750 member companies. Between them, they operate 150,000 outlets across the UK, and that's roughly 95% of the market. So our job is to be the voice and face of those operators to government, to the general public, to the media. So we're a campaign organisation, and we are there to promote the reputation of the sector as a great place to grow, work and invest, so to try and be optimistic and upbeat. We're also there to be a campaigner against the unnecessary costs of doing business, push back against some of those legislative changes, and try and make sure we've got the most supportive regulatory and fiscal environment within which operators can operate. And then we're there to provide insight, intelligence, advice, guidance and support to the businesses, particularly a peer-to-peer networking support for the small to medium size to help them grow and thrive and survive. And then finally, to be a sort of pioneer, a bit of a thought leader to help on the big issues and challenges of the day that are too big for any operator to get to grips with, mostly sustainability, carbon net zero, EDI, employment and skills and training.
Wow, that's a lot that you do there.
It's quite a big comprehensive brief. It keeps me busy.
So how many people work at UK Hospitality?
We've got a small team of 25, so about 20 of them operate out of the London office. We've got an executive director in Scotland, Wales, a sister organisation in Northern Ireland, Hospitality Ulster. So we're the only organisation in our space that deals with the devolved administrations and a Westminster level. So we operate locally, nationally, regionally, devolved administration, and that gives us quite a good insight. And then we've got some consultants who work with us too. So total of 25. So it's a lean team, and we work to maximise everything we can. And we're not for profit. So everything that we get through from events, sponsorship, partnership or membership goes to deliver the services the members need and want.
And just looking at your member base a little bit, you mentioned that you look after big groups and also independents. How can you align both of those views sometimes? Because I'd imagine what the larger corporate wants is slightly different to what the independent wants.
Well, you'd be surprised actually how much is common across all of them. And what I'm very fortunate to have an advisory council of around 30 businesses that are there to be my sounding board. And they skew disproportionately towards independent businesses across each of the segments. And we work hard to make sure that we've got a sectoral representation and a size and scale. And underneath that, we've got separate groups. So pub SMEs, pub large groups, same with restaurants, nightclubs, food to go. And that helps us to sort of have that grassroots reach. And we've also got regional groupings as well and forums so that people can come and give us their views and thoughts. Actually, the main issues of the day are pretty common. You know, people will always talk about the cost of doing business. And it might vary in the priority in which they put them, but that sort of business rates, energy, food costs, labour shortages, that they all come up in the same way, shape or form. The solutions that people are looking for might vary. As I say, the priority rating that they might give us is different, but they're all the same top 5, top 10 issues that come through. There will be some that are very different, you know, sort of food to go, coffee might have something different going on than nightclubs. There might be specific areas to do with nightclub licensing. But as I say, the broad consensus around the issues, the same for all of them. I think the biggest difference we see is that independent businesses, as you well know, tend to be very focused on the here and now. How can they survive? How can they get the next bit coming through. Corporates will have a longer time span, and they'll be looking at investment. They're looking 2 to 3 years hence, or 5 years hence. But the challenges to get there are the same at the moment. Everybody talks to me about top line, not too bad. Never been harder to turn that top line into a bottom line profit. That's the same message I get whether you are the largest chain in the land or single site independent. The pressure is the same. The reality of it for the independent is day-to-day survival. The corporate doesn't have that, but it's still about how do you make the P&L work. And ultimately, for all of these corporate businesses, the bigger chains, they operate a P&L model that is individual outlet based. If that outlet doesn't work on a P&L, they'll close the outlet. It's the same as an independent. So the fundamentals of what goes into making that P&L work, the only bit of flexibility you've got in the model is people. But then it's about property, it's about profitability, it's about the product that you serve, and it's about the permissions you've got. Those fundamentals don't really change.
And before we get on to your 3 asks from UK Hospitality, one thing I was wondering, and I've been following you for some time on Twitter since we did our first podcast, is that one of the questions is, do you think government is listening? The second question is, do you think shadow government is listening? And to those people that all follow you on Twitter and say, why haven't you done it yet? Because I think there is this idea now that because you are liaising with government, that people's expectations are that they should be done sooner. So number 3 is purely around the difficulties of dealing with government, but then 1 and 2 is, are government and shadow government listening?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. It comes up all the time. Are we being heard? Are they listening? You go in and talk to them. Are they really listening? And do they act? I think we do have good access to government and the opposition. They are actively talking to us. It's a slightly lesser level than it was during the peak of COVID. And I do think there is something about people getting used to a trade association, understanding what the trade body does for them. I think many people on Twitter fail to realise we're a membership body. We're framed by our membership. We do as directed. And so, you've got lots of noise on Twitter, but they're not actively involved in shaping what we're doing. So I'd encourage everybody to get involved. Doesn't matter whether it's with us or with a different body, but get involved, make your voice heard so that the people who do have that access are putting it straight through. Get involved in the surveys. We use a lot of data. We do have good access and links with government. We are able to put the views forward. I think there was a debate in the House of Commons last week at which the Minister in the Treasury said exactly that. The industry had been very fragmented, didn't have a clear ask, didn't have any evidence to back it up, and UK Hospitality had transformed that because we were able to provide that authoritative input. That is as frustrating for me that access, being listened to, being heard, doesn't always translate through to action in a meaningful way. It's as frustrating for me as it is for those on Twitter who sound off on the sidelines about it. I think sometimes people misunderstand that I'm not a minister. I can't wave a magic wand. It isn't in my control to deliver it. The other thing that the industry, sort of needs to reflect on is there is a lot of other people making the same points that I am for their different subsectors. And I think during COVID, we were in a unique situation in the economy and in that space of having a particularly acute problem that was unique to us because we were the only sector closed down and other industries weren't in that position. We've now come out of COVID. Everybody is facing energy inflation, food price inflation, cost of living, cost of doing business. It's common across all industries. One of the ministers said to me last week, I know and hear what you're saying about VAT. 57 other trade bodies lobbied me about VAT in one shape or form for different subsectors. So we're in a much noisier environment. So it's not just about making a noise, it's about making sure it's intelligent, informed, authoritative, and even then you need to accept that you're not always going to get the ask that you want.
Yeah, no, definitely. Well, that segues us nicely into the asks, and your ask number 1 is 3% cap on business rate increases. So there's a proposed 6.7% increase to business rates, and that will affect up to 20,000 hospitality businesses. What's your concerns about business rates, Kate?
Well, business rates and property costs are the second highest cost after traditionally, leave aside energy, which has sort of fluctuated, but after people, it's the second highest cost, and it's a fixed cost. And business rates link into rents, and rents link into business rates. So we need to make sure we get this right. Fundamentally, we need root and branch reform, but there is an acute point in April this year when business rates bills go up by the multiplier, and the multiplier is subject to indexation. So we were successful in getting the government in the autumn statement to freeze the multiplier for smaller premises, those below 51,000 rateable value, but around half of hospitality businesses, irrespective of their size, operate out of bigger premises, and particularly those in town and city centre locations. So half of them are going to get an inflation-busting increase in their bills. Inflation is due to drop. It might even get close to the 2%, 3% target, according to the Bank of England. So why would the government want to push through an inflation-busting increase? We'll just have to put up our prices, and many businesses will struggle to survive on that margin. So take action now. Make sure business rates for all are capped. And then we have a fighting chance of survival. So that's a very short-term tactical ask around the April budget. There's a decision point. The government could make it better, but we remain committed to longer-term reform. And we're having active dialogue with the Labour Party, who've said they will rip up the business rates regime and replace it with something new. We need something that reflects the higher cost of doing business for a bricks and mortar hospitality high street business than it does for an online, and we rebalance it. It can't be right that hospitality is 5% of GDP, pays 15% of business rates. So we need a longer term reform, but in the short term, let's make sure we don't make anything worse in April.
Let's fast forward to the longer term view for a moment. What's the perfect rate system for hospitality, do you think? What really works, do you think?
I think it's quite challenging when you put it in the context of reforming a regime that needs to work for the Port Talbot Steelworks, the London Eye, the local corner shop, and an office block. What we've put forward to the Labour Party and this government is a differential level of multiplier. At the moment, the price per pound that you pay is the same if you are an office, a warehouse, an online fulfillment centre, or a hospitality business. It's about 53p in the pound. It used to be closer to 35p. If we could get back to a lower multiplier for hospitality, recognising and reflecting the fact that they are investing in those premises in place, so say 35, 40p, paid for by a higher multiplier on Amazon warehouses and those big fulfillment centres and online businesses, then you can get back to something that works.
It is one of the major issues with rates and the rate system for businesses, the fact that not everybody pays it. You've got the small business relief, charities are exempt up to 80%, churches, religious organisations. There's so many companies and organisations that don't pay, that does fall onto somebody, or so
yes.
Another company, shall I say. And I think if I'm right, it's the likes of, in hospitality, the Wetherspoons is, the McDonald's is, the larger organisations that have larger venues that cannot say, well, actually, we need small business relief. So actually, they pay a lion's share because everybody else probably gets away with it to some degree, legally, of course.
Yeah, I mean, that is the problem. You've got a system that was last reviewed in the 1980s when the high street was very different. The way in which we all used the high street and went to work was incredibly different. And you've had a fundamental shift around COVID. Some of those big offices that used to be the premium locations, you've now downsized. People are moving out of the centre of London. They're offshoring. So you haven't got as many people paying into the business rate system as you used to. And you're right. If the government says that it's got to get £27 billion from rates, we are going to be paying more and more into it. And even the smaller businesses in hospitality, you have to be a really small business to fall below the rateable value threshold and pay nothing. I think it's about £12,000. Rateable value, and as I say, you're considered to be a big business if you're above 51,000. lots of businesses in our sector will be above that and are paying really large business rates bills. So we're paying 15% of all business rates, you've got to do something to reset it and rebalance it. Nobody is saying we shouldn't pay it, but everybody should be paying their fair share.
I was listening to the radio the other day, and I'm going to butcher this, definitely going to butcher this, but they were talking about rates. And I think the journalist says MPs aren't in a rush to fix something like business rates because the people that don't know about it don't care, and the people that it will affect will moan. So, and I've butchered it completely, but basically saying that it's a thankless task that, that those people that will end up having to pay, even if it's a small amount, will not be happy, and it will end up voting them out. So you can see how government just don't like tackling these meatier topics within our industry.
Yes, and that's why, despite the fact that root and branch reform of business rates has been in the Conservative manifesto since 2015, it's not being delivered, because you will always get winners and losers. That's why we think a simpler system is to just look at different rates of multiplier, different price per pound, to reflect the value of the business that's being driven from that premises, and doesn't penalise hospitality and bricks and mortar businesses. It is going to be a challenge. I think the Labour Party will also run into challenges by looking at how do you rip it up and start again and replace it. And for Treasury, it's a good tax because it's difficult to avoid or evade. You've got a fixed building and you're a ratepayer. The issue then is that there's a disconnect between the local business and the services that they get for paying business rates. It just goes centrally into Westminster and then is redistributed, and there's no guarantee that you're going to get services for it. So again, for a hospitality businesses in a town and city centre or a neighbourhood location, they quite rightly ask, what do they get for these business rates bills? And there isn't a clear link. So we've got to re-establish a link between local tax, property tax, and the services you get. And it needs to reflect the earning potential of the business that's occupying that property, rather than something that's based around 1980s values.
Yeah. And I think, just to separate a little bit, there are many smaller cafes, fish and chip shops, very small venues, very residential local places that don't pay rates. And I think because of the small business rate relief. But I totally understand that as a pub, restaurant, hotel, you probably would struggle to ever fall under that small business rate relief. So it feels like, again, that probably at the moment, the system is weighted towards small business. And if that was to change, then small business might say, hey, this ain't right. We're small business. Then, but actually what you're probably suggesting is that it would level the playing field on business rates somewhat.
It would level the playing field. And I think, the challenge we've got is that it's not a small business relief. It's a small premises relief. And so you could have a very big business that is benefiting from small business relief because it's in a small premises. Equally, you could have a small business. We've got several within membership that are independent, single-site businesses that are above that threshold and are paying a large amount of business rates as a result. So we need to get it rebalanced for everybody so that there's a fair share. You want to protect those smaller independent businesses that would otherwise struggle, but you've got to have a balance across the whole of the sector to enable it to flourish and to allow that investment to take place.
So you'd probably like to see it to go sort of end up back at the 30 pence a pound mark, ideally.
Yeah, 35p seemed to be a fair amount. If we could move towards that direction, might not be in one go, but certainly something. The Welsh Government is looking at this. The Welsh Government is looking at legislating to introduce a different multiplier for different types of business to reflect that value and contribution and social impact. Because that's the other thing. Our businesses, whatever that type of business they are, small cafe, takeaway, coffee shop, pub, bar, restaurant, they are neighbourhood community assets. They provide local jobs. They have a great social value footprint in that local area. They'll often source locally. They'll buy in services from local businesses. You need to reflect the value of that as well.
I guess also if we look broadly, town centres are pretty much decimated, and for a multitude of reasons. It's not just, I know everyone wants to put it down to one thing, but it's not. Town centres have really changed over the last 15, 20 years. So if you could encourage a better rate system for everybody, but let's say it benefits restaurants, then that gives people a reason to go to a town centre, doesn't it? It gives people a reason to go pick up a few bits, and rather than just sit at home and do it online.
Absolutely. We know that the dwell time, the spend time in town and city centres that have vibrant food and drink offers is far greater. So retail benefits, officers benefit, people want to live in those places too. You attract in other services. Hospitality has become almost the anchor tenant. So you don't want them moving away altogether. And equally, we need to have something that reflects the value that they bring to those areas.
Yeah, no, definitely. That's a good one, I think. And ask number 2. Again, I don't think you're going to find anything contentious with number 2, but ask number 2 is temporary changes to employer national insurance contributions, a cut in the lower rate of employer NICs to 10%, and increasing the threshold at which contributions are made by the employer will help businesses manage the increase in national living wage. So give us a little rundown of your thoughts behind this one, your members' concerns.
Well, this is really driven by the big increases we've seen in national living wage over the past two years, which are largely delivered because it's pegged to 60% of median earnings. So it's not a deliberate or a decision point that has to be taken. It's just an automatic uplift. And as wage rates have increased across the economy as a whole, so the national living wage jump has been higher than was anticipated. And this last year, it's sort of 10 to 20%, depending on the age of the people that are involved. In the context of everything else that's been going on in the cost of doing business, cost of living crisis that we've got, the only point of flexibility we've got in the model is the margin that's available to the small business in particular, but the business viability and the profitability of that site or that business as a whole. And we've seen over the course of COVID that margin has been eroded by about 40%. And so the headroom to be able to adjust and adapt to big increases in cost base, like the national living wage, which was quite a shock to a lot of people, is just not there. And so this really is about how do we protect jobs and employment opportunities in a sector that is one of the largest employers in the country. And it's about trying to rebalance the tax. So, corporation tax, you have to be making a profit before you benefit from corporation tax, and benefit therefore from capital allowances. Our investment in our premises is often not allowed under the new capital allowances scheme, but we want to be able to invest in our people. So this is all about how can we reduce the pre-profit taxes, and particularly the tax on jobs, to give us that flexibility to make the adjustments our businesses need in order to invest in our people, in training, in job creation. Otherwise, we will go back towards fewer people being employed in our sector and less of a service-led business. So it's about giving us that headroom temporarily. So reversing the cuts, matching the NIC level. The government did cut the personal NIC. This is about cutting employer NIC, and it's about lifting the threshold, which hasn't changed for many years, so that we can take the lowest paid out of tax altogether. And that gives us an incentive to take on people on shorter hours, variable hours. Often that's what's wanted for those people who are long-term unemployed, disabled, ex-offenders, homeless, that the government is looking to place, the sort of economically inactive. They often want shorter hours and variable hours. This gives an incentive for a sector that can take them on to do so. And, when we were talking to government ministers, their assessment around what they did on business rates was premised on the challenges that people would face in the costs, and so in minimum wage. And so therefore it's about trying to rebalance that as well, because it's quite clear that the offset, what was given with business rates, was more than absorbed by the cost increases that we saw coming through on living wage.
So do you think it's ambitious enough for a temporary change? For example, do you think NI should be abolished and replaced with a fairer tax that's not on jobs?
I think that is, there's a very live debate that you might want to have about business taxes in the round. A lot of this and the asks that we framed are about the fact that we're in this very unique set of circumstances, facing into a budget just before a general election. And you've got, you have to deal with play the ball that's in front of you, deal with the situation that you've got. This is about how can we put some small, short-scale tactical issues through and then open up the debate for wider reform post-general election. But to try and ask for something permanent now, it just isn't going to be feasible. And so this is about sort of getting a foot in the door.
Yeah.
If I mix my metaphors.
No, I'm with you. And so again here, small independents would probably have an advantage at the moment, wouldn't they? Because they get a £5,000 employment allowance. So again, this would probably rebalance things for you somewhat.
Yes, and it's also about those who are getting above the employment threshold. You don't have to be a very big business before you're above the definition of outside the definition of an SME because of the numbers of employees that you've got. Because all of the employees are calculated on a head count, not a full-time equivalent. So if you've got lots of part-time workers, even if you are a small business, you'll be affected by it. So yes, this particularly helps the small multiples in our sector of whatever shape or form they are. This would help them get a fighting chance and rebalance it. And for any of those who are just falling on the cliff edge of missing out on that employment allowance, it helps to reset that too. It would be in addition to the employment allowance, I should say.
Yeah. And before we go on to ask number 3, just on a side note, I don't know if you're aware, well, you must be. I think Labour proposed in their manifesto, or at least as part of their campaign, that if they do get in, they'll ditch 0-hour contracts and day one, employers will have day one full employment rights. Have any of your members mentioned any issues surrounding those two topics?
Yes, I mean, that is an area where we're doing quite a lot of work at the moment. Even if people don't use 0 hours contracts, this proposal on 0 hours contracts from Labour would have an impact on casual, variable and temporary workers and how they are framed. The suggestion is that the first 12 weeks that you are employed, if you've got variable hours, would form your reference period. And that would be your guaranteed minimum hours, which may well work for lots of people, both employers and employees. But you can see many circumstances in a seasonal business where that doesn't work. If you are unfortunate enough to have your first 12 weeks in the quiet season, your guaranteed minimum hours may be very low. Equally, if you are working during the busy summer season and you're a student or you're a working mum who wants to take on extra hours during the school holidays, you might find that you're stuck with very high minimum hours that you want to change. And it's not quite clear yet how you would change that or how that would apply in a seasonal business. But it could end up with the worst of all worlds, that it doesn't suit the employer and it doesn't suit the employee. So we're talking to the unions and to the Labour Party to see if we can find a way of lengthening that reference period, giving people some greater flexibility if they do genuinely want variable hours, rather than having a one-size-fits-all approach. The day one employment rights, obviously, that will be particularly challenging in sectors like ours, where, again, you've got large numbers of people who will move in and out of employment. And obviously you've got day one trade union recognition.
Yeah, it just seems like there's no leeway given there. I think if I'm right, at the moment it's 2 years, is it, full employment rights?
Yes.
Yeah. Obviously, you could argue how that's probably a bit too long for people that maybe have an issue, but the day one seems like. So could someone say to Labour, look, if you get in, which is probably likely given what's going on, is 6 months a nice window for you here?
Yes, or you need that day one to start from the end of your probationary period. I mean, probationary periods are there for a reason. It just seems as though it's very blunt at the moment and hasn't necessarily been thought through, and could mean that workers get a rawer deal than they would do at the moment if you had a little bit more flexibility. But I do think there's an open dialogue to be had there around the challenges that would face. And also, I think a need to recognise that, and this is where I don't think there's enough recognition of it, that lots of people do choose variable hours, want variable hours. It benefits their lifestyle. It helps them to be able to say 20 hours one week, 40 hours the next, nothing for the next 5 weeks. My daughters who are students who've worked in hospitality while they're at university do want that. So do lots of people who are returning from work with caring responsibilities. So we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. The principle is let's get rid of abusive contracts. And I think there's a lot the industry can do to make sure we've got a positive story to tell about rooting out those abuses and making sure that people are given the opportunity to move to contracts if they want them.
And that's not just the hospitality industry, that's every industry that employs people. And really, it's an enforcement issue. If the 0-hour contract is being abused, then that needs to be enforced. And I think there's a pattern that seems to be evolving here that, and it's probably not just over here, where enforcement is weak. With whatever it seems that goes wrong, whether it's 0-hour contract abuse or what we're going to get onto next, it feels like that the enforcement of that issue just seems a bit timid, let's say.
Yes, and I do think, good operators will always want to see bad practice rooted out because it means they've got a fair level playing field. The last thing you want is the business next door to you not enforcing the minimum standards that are required and competing on an unfair basis. So I do think enforcement needs looking at and we need to make sure it's fair and proportionate.
Yeah. So the juiciest one I would imagine out of your three, which is, I'm just saying that based on your Twitter feed, is probably the fact that you guys are also asking for a lower rate of VAT for hospitality, leisure and tourism. A 12.5% VAT rate is proven to boost demand, generate revenue, keep prices low. It's the single greatest catalyst for growth in hospitality, with 70% of businesses passing through reduced prices to customers. So give us your background as to why you chose this and why you think it's the right tool for the job.
Well, I think, you've just summarised the key points that we made there. When we're looking at this, we're facing into this tsunami of costs and they're not getting any better. And we've absorbed as a sector, we've absorbed as much as we can take. And you've seen margins eroded and prices increasing. But we know that the rate at which prices are increasing is not enough to offset all those costs. So that's not sustainable for these businesses longer term. So we need to look at something that fundamentally changes it, because COVID, the inflation, the debt crisis and the COVID-related debt, as well as the war in Ukraine and what that's meant for energy, it's fundamentally changed the business model that many of us are operating under in the hospitality sector. And so you do need something to give it a reset. And in the face of all those costs, if we're wanting to drive down inflation, we need to give a tool that will really address the cost and the price to the consumer. And VAT is the only way you can do that significantly, because it has a direct impact on price and sales price. And we have the highest rate of VAT across Europe. We're the only country, apart from Denmark, in the OECD that doesn't offer a lower rate of VAT for hospitality and tourism services. And now we're outside of the EU, we can choose to have a multiple different rate. So previously the choice was 20% or 5%. We can do 12.5% now. And 12.5% is the rate at which the flat rate scheme applies. If people are small micro businesses, they can choose to pay 12.5% and not have to do the full calculation. So 12.5% has a relevance in the sector. And I think the reason we chose this was because it is the speediest intervention. If you're looking at what can unlock growth in our sector, drive demand, impact prices, change the profitability of the businesses involved, this has a day one impact. As soon as you cut it, it feeds straight through immediately. And we saw how it worked during COVID. We saw how it worked when Gordon Brown did it immediately post the financial crash. It has a direct impact, and it would be the fastest changing thing that we could do.
So as a consumer, I follow obviously your followers on Twitter, and I look at the dialogue they have with you, and I look at the dialogue they have with their customers, and where a few of them are constantly saying we need lower VAT to you, and they're tweeting it, I'm seeing their customers or their followers saying to them, but would you drop VAT to us? And what I've seen mostly is 3 or 4 tweets later, a thread as such. And really, it could have been a 2-letter tweet which says no, and a few people that actually truly understand VAT as a consumer tax, not a business tax. They're saying, but you're not going to pass it on to us. So how can it stimulate the economy? How can it stimulate purchases? What's your answer to sort of that person's argument?
Well, I think the key point is, during COVID, we know 70% of businesses did pass it through in part or in full. And in some cases, that was an immediate drop when it came through in 2020. And I know many businesses remained closed during that period in time, but we did see significant price cuts going through from across the board. Maybe not all of it, but a large proportion of it. The second point is we are facing significant cost increases, which will result in a price increase in April. If you reduce the VAT, you stop that price increase coming through. So you would see, no price increase, it doesn't feel the same as a cut. It's the same as the inflation argument, but it would stop prices going up. So consumers would see the benefit of it. And the final point is it's going to be different across different parts of the economy and different parts of the sector, that people can see the VAT impact going through and be able to explain it to customers. So we know in hotels, in visitor accommodation, in some of the larger chains, they can pass it on. The independents may not be able to, but it will insulate them from price increases, and it will keep that business head above water until they can better adjust it in price. So you will see it across the board. It won't always happen in every premises in the same way. But as I say, I go back to, even in COVID, 70% did pass it on in part or in full.
In our industry, a lot of fish and chip groups, I guess, and there's also lots of general takeaways. The general consensus is that I think basically 2 or 3% of them passed it on during COVID. But I do think that, I'm not saying that to make anyone look bad. I think the COVID VAT drop was a completely different thing.
Yes.
It was to keep people in business, pretty much. It was, as part of a few other packages at the time to then help everybody stay above water. So, but if everyone in that industry, let's say, Karen, doing the same thing, you're right. It could, stop businesses from putting up prices. However, there is no guarantee. And I think when I did a bit of research on VAT and it being dropped to consumers, one of the recent products, which is women's sanitary products, that hasn't resulted in a big drop for consumers. And I think it's gone down to went down to from 20% to 5% to 0%. And apparently consumers haven't seen any direct benefit. So if that logic was applied, you could see how consumers would feel ripped off, But I guess you would argue that that's the restaurant's job to try and explain to the consumer why they didn't.
Yes, and if you look at France, when it happened in France, the industry did put together a sort of contract almost with the government and with the unions about what proportion they would use in different ways. So there was an acknowledgement that there was a need for these businesses to get through a difficult situation. Some of it would be invested in staff, and I think people would understand if we were absorbing some of that, and some of it would be passed on in price. The sanitary products, again, it's very difficult to be able to differentiate, split out what happened there, as opposed to some of the other cost pressures that the industry was facing at that point in time, both retail, manufacturing and distribution. In a rising inflationary environment, that can get absorbed and customers don't see it. We would need to work hard to be able to demonstrate how we had stopped prices going up, how we had cut prices where appropriate, and saved businesses. So it's a threefold. It's not always going to immediately pass through, but I think the customer understands the value of hospitality. They saw what happened when in COVID it was closed down, how the impact that had on the economy. So I think there would be a little bit more understanding.
Well, another point that a lot of your followers, which are, let's say, restaurant owners, chefs, etc., they always point to the fact that France, Italy, Greece, let's say, etc., they have a lower VAT rate for hospitality. But one thing that stands out also is that a lot of ingredients and supermarket products are also standard VAT rated in those countries, which isn't the case in the UK. So do you see it again as ministers might panic a bit and think, 1 minute, we've got to be careful how we do this because we still need the revenue and we can't tax anything else because we're very conscious that we're already upsetting people in the UK. And I think that's one of the things that people either don't know or deliberately choose to leave out, that actually those products in Europe are VAT rated. I guess you wouldn't want that either, would you? You wouldn't want to go to the supermarket and have 12.5% added to, I don't know, I'm just thinking a tin of beans, let's say.
No, and I think that this is why it is a very difficult and challenging campaign to push, and the chances of success are really quite slim. It's not as easy and straightforward. Everybody looks at it and says, well, the logical thing to do would be this. Well, logic only takes you so far in politics, and then politics does take over. And you've got to square that circle. And, the other alternative way of looking at it is, how much does the Treasury think it's going to forego in tax revenues if it reduces VAT? And what does that equate to? So, Treasury model, I know it's very frustrating when it gets quoted to people, but the Treasury has to say what the cost is and can't speculate on the potential benefits. So lots of people will say, well, but if you cut the VAT, people would go out more, you'd get more tax revenue, it would go up, people would be employed, it would be better, and it would all be brilliant. And unfortunately, the Treasury can't model that cost-benefit analysis. It can only look at the total reduction in take that it gets. And, our contribution, about £31 billion goes from our sector in VAT receipts to the Exchequer. So it's a large sum of money at the same time as, they are looking at how do they fund public services and how do they fund tax cuts for customers. So it is a difficult balancing act. And you're right, when people talk about tax parity with supermarkets and ready meals, I think there is a line to take there about the ready meals and the food to go that you can buy from supermarkets and whether that should have VAT. But if you're looking at everyday food items, it's not quite the same.
I think you've just took me to my next point, really, and that is, on a broader note, should all out-of-home food carry VAT? And if it did, then is there a logic to say that VAT could be at a low rate? Because if we look at the words value added, you could argue that buying a sandwich from the supermarket that's sitting on a shelf waiting for you is value added, because we could have easily made it at home for 90% of the cost. And we chose the convenience. And for me, convenience is value added. Is the VAT system outdated also?
I think this highlights a sort of broader issue that the whole of the tax system is outdated. When national insurance was first introduced, people were paying into their social security pot and they knew what they were going to take out of it. Now it's all just paying into general taxation that the government needs to raise. Everything is outdated. You probably need to look afresh at the way in which all forms of tax are levied, but that's hugely complicated. And in the meantime, the government needs ever more money to be able to fund the services it wants to deliver. So, yes, the logic of your question is right, that perhaps we need to reassess what a sales tax is and what it's levied on. But that's, I think, a big can of worms for the government to start to open, and there would be winners and losers.
Oh, I think what I've learned in my few years of following anything related to the economy is that it's full of winners and losers, and the losers will scream loud and the winners don't really cheer that much either. So again, the government just sort of, I can see how they think, well, we're going to upset this subset of people whilst the others ain't exactly screaming for us either. So, yes. And I think, if you look at like bakeries like Greggs, for example, like I was in a Greggs the other week and I just said to them, can you warm up something for me? And they said, no, we can't, because there's a whole VAT thing and it's ambient. And I was like, yeah, happy to pay the VAT. I just wanted something hot for my boy. And they were like, no, can't do it because we don't want to enter that grey area. And I was like, yes. okay, not a problem. I'd almost think that if there was a lower rated VAT for all out of home food, they would actually embrace it, because now there's this sort of grey area clouded above their business where, and they're probably one of the biggest VAT collectors in the country, full stop, anyway, because 2/3 of their menu collects VAT. So this would just make it very consistent for them. But at the moment, it feels like, and we're not the only country that has a messed up VAT system, by any odds. I've read up on quite a lot of the countries that have a messed up VAT system, and I think it's never perfect for anybody. There's no perfect VAT system out there.
No, but it obviously, I mean, for anybody who's got a long enough memory, think about George Osborne and David Cameron and the pasty tax, and how that was supposed to be a sort of trying to do some of the evening out that you're talking about. And as soon as you look at raising tax in one particular area, it becomes quite controversial. So, in the current environment, I can't see anybody doing it. But in all of the areas that we've talked about, we're looking at systems that don't quite work, where there's little sticking plasters, where everybody would like to pay a little bit less tax, and we'd like to try and rebalance it. And unpicking all of that will be very challenging. And in all of those areas, you'll have winners and losers. So, unfortunately, the losers are usually consumers, and they are voters. And so that's why you end up tending to get the status quo staying as it is. But that's no reason why we shouldn't try and challenge it, try and get some logic into it, and see if we can get that boost that the hospitality sector needs and deserves.
I think one of the things that you've just sort of highlighted with the whole pasty tax debate back then is that, let's give them credit where credit's due. They wanted to clean up the system. But it was the newspapers, The Sun, actually, that coined the term pasty tax and got everyone riled up. And you think, well, are we a bit of a weak country politically, where we just, once the papers or the news get involved, we sort of cave a little bit, and rather than actually say, no, this is for the best, you don't realise that this is actually a bit of a headache. You're not going to like it in the meantime, but in 4 weeks, you've all forgotten about it anyway. And it was like this over COVID, like whatever policy came out that was sort of, let's say, commonsensical, if the news outlets all got behind it, they swayed popular opinion. And I think a lot of people would say, oh, well, but it's the voting public. But it wasn't. It was the newspapers. So yes. From your point of view, you'd rather they just listen to organisations like your own rather than getting swayed by the media.
I think it's quite important that we have evidence-based decision-making, particularly if we're looking at tax issues and cost issues. And we need to have that authoritative information about the realities of doing business that needs to be reflected in that broader policy. Treasury tends to look at things in a very macro level, and that disguises a lot of what's going on beneath the surface, particularly with smaller businesses. Probably what we're highlighting here is that it's quite opaque when you do tax changes and you do financial support. It has to be. The Treasury needs to work with a degree of secrecy when it's looking at budgets and tax reform. But what we really need to have is some longer term strategic thinking, and that's largely been missing as a result of what's happened with COVID. We've been in crisis mode as a country, as an economy, as businesses for a bit too long, and we've stopped thinking about that 3 to 5 year outlook.
Yeah. A few episodes ago, I had a guest on, and his biggest gripe with VAT was obviously the 20%. He was not a fan of that. His biggest issue surrounding VAT was evasion. He said it's a real big issue. It's not being talked about. He said, in his view, HMRC aren't doing enough about it. He spoke about double invoicing, where wholesalers are allowing essentially 2 invoices to go out to a business, one saying cash sale they can just throw in the bin. That allows them to then, well, I guess it allows them to then show less purchases and then also show less sales. Would you like to see, or do you think government even are putting pressure on trying to close all these loopholes?
I don't think they are, because I think that they're taking a sort of slightly light touch at the moment, because there is pressure that HMRC is putting on legitimate businesses who are not evading tax. that is pushing some of them towards the edge of bankruptcy and insolvency, and HMRC needs to have a bit of flexibility to not pursue that. I think one of the live debates is around enforcement and closing loopholes, and the other one is around the VAT threshold. Should we have a threshold, because that drives a lot of this behaviour. It also drives people to make decisions about their business rather than growing it. And that's one of the things that politicians will often ask me is, should it be lower? Should it be much higher? Is 85,000 the right point to start paying VAT to be a legitimate business? Or should it be scrapped altogether so that everybody pays a little bit? And again, that comes back to your point about, if you did that, could you put a lower rate of VAT through because more people are brought in, but you're all paying a lower rate? Now, there are complexities around that for small businesses that are to do with the administration. And so an expansion of the flat rate scheme might help in those circumstances. But I think it's a live debate we need to have as a sector, rather than reaching for what seems to be an easy solution and forgetting to think about all the complexities behind it.
From what I've been told, there's been numerous debates constantly about whether to go higher or lower, and no one can ever agree. They just don't, that no one knows whether actually. I think that both sides seem uncertain. So, and I guess that's cross-party. So there's no winners in that one. And again, if there's no clear reason to do something, no one's going to do it. And then I was told that a lot of European countries have a very low threshold, but they're just not enforced. So nothing ever really happens. And if you look at like countries like Spain and Italy and Greece, they're not going out to the little villages to look at what these little restaurants or little shops are doing. They're just not. They're too far out of the way. Whereas in the UK, I think it is causing a little problem, because if someone's getting to like 82,000 a year, they're thinking, 1 minute, I've got a good life. Now I've got to start collecting 20%. Or, so you could, and I'm not knocking them. That's not to be derisory to anybody. You can see how it's a problem, and surely that stops growth, because you'd want businesses to just keep pushing through and saying, you know what, we want to take more money, we want to serve more people. Whereas if you're then saying, well, actually, I don't want to serve more people, that's anti-business, isn't it? Surely.
Yes, and you do get certain parts of the country, particularly in those highly seasonal areas that are tourism areas, people just closing the doors just to sort of hibernate through and avoid going over the tax threshold. At best, at worst, it does fuel some evasive behaviour, and I just don't think it's sensible. But you're right, we do need to have that grown-up debate as an industry about what do we really want. Is there a quid pro quo there that might enable us to get a lower rate if more people were brought into the tax take with different thresholds? Because there is a benefit to the company for being VAT registered in certain circumstances, but you get lots of small independents feeling that they are nothing but a tax collector for the government. An unpaid tax collector is what I often hear, because they can't see that direct feed through as to the benefit and how it's affecting their business. So, I do think there's a broader discussion to be had about what would be better for our sector going forward, what tax system really works. But that might end up with all of us paying a little bit more or a little bit differently.
Yeah. And I think nobody likes the unknown. Nobody likes the word differently, do they? It's a bit of an unknown, so I get it completely. So one thing I'd like to finish with essentially is, you've chosen these 3 things. What didn't make it onto the list? So, for example, is there something out there that's just as important, but you couldn't put it on this list? You had to choose other things.
There's a variety of things that sort of go into those discussions and that could be relevant. There's tax-free shopping, duty-free sales, there's capital allowances, there's tax credits, there's universal credit for workers and the impact that has on the hours that they work. There's tax reliefs for employers for provision of some of the services government would like around, healthcare, GPs, mental health and well-being, occupational health. There's a plethora of issues that could come through. There's also sort of smaller scale issues that are just sector specific that would only affect one bit of the industry. So what we've done is to try and prioritise it based on what looks realistic for us as a sector to be asking for, and what has the impact across everybody, because otherwise you've got a shopping list of about 20. You don't look realistic as a sector in reflecting what's going on with public services, and there's a lack of prioritisation. And there is a list that you can give to government, and then they say, well, you can't agree amongst yourselves what your top ask is. So, I've tried to narrow it down to 3. Government will always say to me, what's the number one? What's the single thing that would make a difference? And then it's a balancing act between whether you think it's realistic or not.
So what's your number one on this list?
Out of those 3, the top one that would be a priority that would have the biggest impact is VAT.
VAT.
The most likely one that we can achieve something on is business rates.
Yeah. It sounds like that they're all... The first 2, to many, probably just think... And I think it's just because VAT is such a looming thing, right? But I think they're still just as important. They're very important. Business rates is something that, talking to large restaurant owners, hotel businesses, it really is an anchor on their business. It really is.
Yes.
But the larger businesses that I deal with, they work with VAT. Don't get me wrong, they'd like lower VAT. I think the truth is that most people would like VAT, even if they're not going out of business. Whether they need it to survive or thrive, they'd like lower VAT, because there's a portion of that that's left for the business. And, just talking as a business person, it's an attractive proposition. But they've learned to work with it. It's there. They don't really calculate it in their business. It just sits on the side. They never calculate it in their turnover. It's just not considered. Whereas I think a lot of the smaller businesses do rely on it for cash flow. And I think that's where it enters the everyday running of the business. And that's probably why they feel like unpaid tax collectors.
Yes, and in the good times, when the economy's booming, when business is robust and vibrant pre-COVID, they probably didn't see VAT as so much of a cash flow driver. But when you're struggling, and the VAT bill is the thing that's going to tip you over the edge because you can't afford to pay that quarter, that becomes a sore point. And unfortunately for many people as well, it's the easy and obvious and logical thing to grab hold of. If you were talking about a lever that changes the dynamic of the business immediately, VAT is the one that they would go to. And lots of people in the restaurant side probably didn't think about it before COVID, but now they've seen the effect it can have. It's the one thing they latch onto as the quick and easy solution. And it is quick and easy for the business. It's huge and complicated for the government. And squaring that circle is a real challenge.
What about the cynics that think, you know what, if you can't work within this framework, it's existed since the late 70s, you shouldn't be in business? What about those cynics that say that?
Well, I think it's the fact that the fundamental model has been broken by COVID. This is a sort of once in a generation change that has happened there. Hopefully less frequently than once in a generation, once in a century, cataclysmic event that's hit the sector that has fundamentally changed profitability, viability and trading models and had that impact going through. So this is a bit of a reset moment. So I understand why people would say, if you can't make money or you can't pay your people or you can't do X and Y, but try doing that when you've got a very narrow net profit margin at the best of times, and that's just been hit and decimated by what's happened with COVID and the war in Ukraine. If you take your example of the fish and chip shops, you can't run it in the same way because of what's happened with tariffs on fish, oil, the potato impact. Those costs of business have just increased overnight, let alone the energy. And so it's the fact that you've got those factors coming together that have changed the business model. So anything that you plotted as a business just has to get ripped up and thrown out the window.
But a lot of those pressures have eased off somewhat. So I guess just trying to look at it from both sides of the coin here. I like to sort of like play devil's advocate here because I think it's really important because I'm a taxpayer and a business person. So, but I see it from the restaurant's point of view, completely, that their business model once worked and everything shifted from under them and now it doesn't. And that must be heartbreaking. There is nothing worse than having what was a great business that everything's changed around them. But at the same time, you could argue from an outsider's point of view, well, life changes. Do something that does work to those people, but I think this is the thing about winners and losers in the economy, isn't it? There's always someone and you might make all these changes and get through, and people still don't make it through.
Yeah, and you can't save every business, and that is something that government comes back to time and time again when we talk to them. And by government, I mean both major parties, because you've got such a problem with the public finances. They are all going to be tough. And they will say our sector is traditionally a sector of entrepreneurs. You will get startups, you will always get business failures. Small businesses fall over every year. They protected our sector through COVID, and perhaps, therefore, you didn't have as many falling over as you might otherwise have. So this is natural wastage, natural attrition. And the other thing that they say is that we're a phoenix industry. If somebody fails, things will get better, the situation will improve, and it will right itself. But that's partly why we framed our asks as temporary injections, just to get businesses through what is a particularly acute, particularly difficult, particularly hospitality specific set of challenges. And when it gets better and when the economy improves, then those businesses will repay you and the return on investment will come.
Excellent. Well, Kate, you've answered everything beautifully as ever, and thank you so much for your time today. You've been amazing.
Thank you so much for having me. Always good to chat.
I really enjoyed chatting to Kate from UK Hospitality. I think there are some real issues and they are giving government a real good push. What did you think to the episode, and what do you think to their 3 asks? This episode product sponsor is the Ceres Deep Fryer Cleaner. Maximise oil life, improve food quality, keep your fries in peak condition. Don't let neglect cost you money or customers. Visit ceres.shop to get yours. Cleaner fryers and better business with Ceres. If you want to keep in the loop with what we're doing at Ceres, you should be following us on social media. But to get the information delivered directly to your inbox, join our mailing list, and the link will be in the episode show notes. Be sure to share this episode with your friends on social media. If you like this episode, then chances are others in the industry will like it too. If you have a moment, do us a favour and leave us a review on Apple Podcasts.